Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're taking a totally fresh and honestly pretty radical look at a system that's been debated, used, and, well, dismissed for literally thousands of years. We're going to explore a really bold premise based on some fascinating recent academic analysis. Basically, we're decoding the ancient symbolic language of astrology and translating it into the highly rigorous modern scientific frameworks of chronobiology and systems neuroscience. So, get ready because we're about to look at an ancient tradition through a thoroughly modern lens.
Okay, let's dive right into this. What if the zodiac isn't, mystical magic, but is actually a heavily encoded biological blueprint? I mean, for the longest time, modern science has pretty comfortably tossed astrology into the pseudoscience bucket. But recent interdisciplinary research suggests we might have accidentally thrown out a core truth along with all that mysticism. Think about it. What if the archetypes mapped out by early astronomers were actually just early human attempts to categorize very real neurodevelopmental trajectories, traits shaped by the literal seasons? It's wild to think about.
So, here's our roadmap for this explainer. 1. Beyond the mystical horoscope. 2. The biology of birth timing. 3. Translating the 4 elements. 4. Planets as neural circuits. 5. Mapping the 12 houses. And finally, 6, a unified biological blueprint. All right, section 1, beyond the mystical horoscope. Historically, early astrology was essentially our ancestors' attempt at a unified theory of health and environment. And modern psychology's founding figures, they actually saw this depth too. As early as 1911, Carl Jung wrote, "I make horoscope calculations in order to find a clue to the core of psychological truth. We shall one day discover in astrology a good deal of knowledge that has been intuitively projected into the heavens." Jung's perspective is absolutely vital here. It shifts our whole framing. We're moving away from predicting the future via magic to understanding astrology as a kind of pre-modern psychology. It was a way for our ancestors to map out unconscious archetypes and behavioral patterns way, way before they had MRI machines. Moving on to section 2, the biology of birth timing. So how do we actually bridge this ancient intuition with hard science? Well, we anchor it in chronobiology. That's the study of how environmental time shapes our biology. And this brilliantly illustrates the point. Just look at the data. Over 3 decades of epidemiological literature confirms that your birth month statistically correlates with very real psychiatric outcomes. For instance, folks born during the winter months, especially in the Northern Hemisphere, actually show a significantly elevated incidence of schizophrenia. On the flip side, kids born in the spring show a higher prevalence of ADHD and learning disorders. The time of year you enter the world, it literally leaves a lasting biological imprint.
Now, you might be wondering, how does that actually work? The mechanism behind this birth month phenomenon is all about perinatal light exposure. During those absolutely crucial neurodevelopmental windows, the mother's, and therefore the fetus's exposure to environmental light dictates exactly how the pineal gland regulates melatonin. And melatonin isn't just a sleep aid, right? It acts as a master clock that modulates your serotonin levels and your cortisol rhythms. These hormonal cycles fundamentally wire and shape fetal brain development. It is a direct physiological link between celestial mechanics, like the Earth's rotation around the sun, and human neurobiology. Pretty amazing, right?
Okay, let's move to section 3 and see how this builds. Translating the 4 elements. Let's see how this biological timing translates into those famous astrological elements, starting with the fire signs, Aries, Leo, and Sagittarius. Historically, these correspond to the choleric temperament, hot, dry, active, bold. Biologically, this perfectly mirrors the highly active dopaminergic systems in the brain. The dopaminergic loop drives reward-seeking behavior, assertiveness, impulsivity, and motivation. So when we say someone has a fiery personality, we are colloquially describing a dopamine-dominant neural profile. It's a perfect match. Conversely, let's look at the earth signs, Taurus, Virgo, and Capricorn. Ancient astrology labels this the melancholic temperament, cautious, grounded, stable. In modern neuroscience, this beautifully aligns with serotonergic systems and prefrontal cortex regulation. Serotonin is what drives discipline, the delay of gratification, and biological homeostasis. So earth signs perfectly mirror this cautious, grounding regulation, the kind of brain that seeks material stability over impulsive thrills. Then we've got the air signs, Gemini, Libra, and Aquarius. Traditionally linked to the sanguine temperament, these signs are characterized as communicative, quick, and socially agile. Neurobiologically, this maps right onto the interplay between acetylcholine and dopamine. That specific neurochemical balance facilitates high cognitive flexibility, intense curiosity, verbal dexterity, and robust sociability. Basically, all the classic hallmarks of the archetypal air element. Finally, the water signs, Cancer, Scorpio, and Pisces, representing the phlegmatic temperament. So the crucial point here is how perfectly this watery intuition mirrors our oxytocin-agergic systems. Water signs are known for deep emotional attachments, limbic sensitivity, and intuition. And guys, this is the exact behavioral profile of a brain heavily regulated by oxytocin. That's the hormone responsible for profound emotional bonding, empathy, and sensitive affect regulation within the limbic system. This brings us to Section 4, planets as neural circuits.
We've seen how the elements reflect neurochemical tones, but what about the planets? Rather than thinking of them as magic floating rocks controlling our destiny, think of them as symbolic representations of functional brain circuits. Now, what's really interesting about this is how systematically they map out. Mars symbolizes drive and aggression, which links directly to the motor cortex and dopamine circuits. The moon governs emotion and instinct. Well, neurobiologically, that's the HPA axis and the amygdala managing our emotional tides. Venus symbolizes bonding and aesthetics, mapping right onto the nucleus accumbens and oxytocin reward networks. And Mercury, the ancient messenger of language and cognition, that correlates directly with Broca's area and the prefrontal cortex. It's like the ancients were literally categorizing brain functions by assigning them planetary avatars.
All right, Section 5, mapping the 12 houses. If planets are the circuits and signs are the chemistry, the astrological houses represent the situational context. Let's walk through just a few of them to give you an idea. The first house relates to embodied identity. This aligns with sensory-motor integration and how we physically project ourselves into the world. The fourth house rules the home and safety, correlating with the hippocampus and vagal feedback loops that govern emotional homeostasis and early attachment. The seventh house governs relationships, activating social cognition circuits like the TPJ, which is essentially the brain's empathy center. And the eighth house, the domain of trauma and transformation, perfectly mirrors limbic reactivity and deep epigenetic memory. So the houses aren't physical places. They're simply domains of behavioral activation. And finally, Section 6, a unified biological blueprint. When we take a step back and bring all these translated pieces together, we get what we call the celestial chronobiological resonance model. Let's follow the flow here. It starts right at the top with literal environmental signals, specifically seasonal light. That light dictates your perinatal epigenetic imprint, which then structurally calibrates your brain circuits. And ultimately, that circuitry produces your personality output. Boom! This is the actual biological mechanism of how your environment shaped you from day one. So, what does this all mean? By translating the mythic language of the zodiac into the empirical language of neuroscience, we aren't validating magic. We are validating the profound observational power of our ancestors. They recognized deep biological rhythms way before they had the scientific tools to actually measure them, which leaves us with one incredibly provocative thought to end on today. When we look up and read the stars, are we really reading the heavens, or are we just reading our own perfectly synchronized biology? Thanks for joining me on this explainer. I really hope it left you looking at both history and science in a completely new light.